In May of 633 AD, on a scorched plain near the Euphrates, an imperial army walked into a battlefield it believed was already won. 40,000 men, heavy infantry drilled in Roman discipline, armored cavalry that had crushed rebellions from Egypt to Anatolia, veterans of an empire that had ruled the Mediterranean world for centuries. Across from them stood barely 15,000 Arabs. No walls, no fortresses, no reinforcements coming. By sunset, the imperial army would no longer exist as a fighting force. Not because it was weaker, not because it was outnumbered, but because it never understood where the battle actually was. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Khalid ibn al-Walid executed one of the most terrifying battlefield maneuvers in military history, why the Byzantine commanders believed victory was guaranteed, and how an army that thought it was advancing into a conventional engagement found itself annihilated from directions it didn't even know existed. But to understand how Walaja became a killing ground, we need to go back. Before the armies formed, before the banners rose, to a moment when the Eastern Roman Empire still believed this war would be easy. Because every disaster begins with confidence. For centuries, the Eastern Roman, what we now call Byzantine Empire, had mastered warfare through structure, legions, formations, depth, control. Their doctrine was simple: hold ground, absorb impact, then grind the enemy down with discipline and mass. It had worked against Persians, Goths, Slavs, and rebels alike. When Rome brought numbers, training, and heavy infantry to a battlefield, history usually followed one path. And in 633 AD, Rome believed it was facing yet another peripheral threat: fast-moving desert fighters, brave, fanatical, but ultimately brittle when pressed by real imperial force. That assumption would cost them everything. The Roman high command in Syria assembled an army designed not for subtlety, but for finality. Contemporary sources vary, but conservative estimates place the force at 35,000 to 40,000 men. At its core, heavy infantry, shielded, armored, trained to hold formation under pressure, supporting them. Elite cavalry units, cataphracts encased in iron, designed to deliver crushing shock at decisive moments. Archers, engineers, auxiliaries. This was not a raiding force. It was an extermination army. Across the plain, Khalid ibn al-Walid commanded a force barely half that size. Roughly 15,000 warriors, drawn from the Rashidun Caliphate's armies, tribal fighters hardened by years of constant campaigning, light cavalry, mobile infantry, men who had marched hundreds of kilometers across desert, fought multiple battles without rest, and survived. But numbers alone don't win wars. Psychology does. The Byzantine commanders looked at Khalid's army and saw weakness: fewer men, lighter armor, no reserves, no fortifications, no obvious defensive terrain. Everything about the situation reinforced their belief that this would be a decisive imperial correction, one overwhelming engagement to end Arab resistance in Iraq and Syria permanently. And that belief shaped every decision they made next. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The battlefield at Walaja was not chosen by accident. It was a wide plain bordered by low ridges and broken ground, terrain that appeared open, predictable, controllable. Perfect, the Byzantines believed, for heavy infantry to advance, fix the enemy in place, and crush them head-on. That belief was their first mistake, because Khalid ibn al-Walid did not intend to fight the battle the Romans had prepared for. To understand why, you need to understand Khalid himself. By 633 AD, Khalid was not an improviser. He was not reckless. He was not chasing glory. He was something far more dangerous: a battlefield mathematician. Every campaign Khalid had fought taught him the same lesson: never attack strength directly if you can make it irrelevant. Roman infantry was unbeatable when it could anchor itself, maintain formation, and apply steady pressure. So Khalid didn't plan to break the Roman line. He planned to remove the idea of a line altogether, but he couldn't do it immediately. Not with numbers against him. Not with an enemy that still believed itself safe. First, the Byzantines had to commit. And to make them commit, Khalid did something that looked like hesitation. He deployed his army in a conventional-looking formation. Infantry in the center. Cavalry on the wings. No visible reserves. No movement behind the lines. To Roman eyes, this confirmed everything they believed. The Arabs were preparing to receive an imperial assault. They were bracing. They were reactive. The Roman commanders smiled. This is where inevitability begins. The Byzantines advanced methodically, shields locked, banners high, drums beating the cadence of empire. Their infantry pushed forward, expecting resistance, attrition, and eventual collapse. Instead, they found something unsettling. The Arab line did not break. It bent. It yielded ground slowly. It absorbed pressure without panicking. This was not how tribal armies were supposed to behave. Hour after hour, the Romans pressed. Casualties mounted on both sides, but nothing decisive happened. No collapse, no rout, no breakthrough. To the Byzantine commanders, this was frustrating, but also reassuring. Attrition favored Rome. Time favored Rome. Numbers favored Rome. And most importantly, the Arabs appeared to have nowhere to go. What the Romans did not know, what they could not see, was that the battle had already moved beyond the space in front of them. Because while Roman eyes were fixed on the center, Khalid's attention was elsewhere, behind the ridges, beyond the flanks. In the blind spots, doctrine doesn't teach you to fear. The Roman army was advancing deeper into a field that was slowly, invisibly, becoming a trap. But the trap had not closed yet. For it to work, the Byzantines had to believe they were winning. And so, Khalid waited. By mid-morning at Walaja, the Byzantine commanders believed the battle was unfolding exactly as doctrine predicted. The Arab center was giving ground, not collapsing, yielding. Step by step, controlled, disciplined withdrawal. To a Roman officer trained in imperial warfare, this looked like the final phase, before failure. An outmatched enemy absorbing pressure until cohesion finally shattered. This was how Rome had broken enemies for centuries. Push, hold, grind. The Byzantines committed more weight to the advance. Heavy infantry rotated forward in fresh ranks. Cavalry units moved closer to the flanks, ready to exploit the moment when Arab resistance cracked. And still, it didn't. Instead, something far more dangerous was happening. The Roman army was stretching, not visibly, not dramatically, but inevitably. As the imperial line advanced, cohesion required constant correction. Units adjusted spacing. Officers shouted commands. Formation shifted to maintain contact across uneven ground. Each adjustment was minor. Each correction was necessary. Together, they created gaps. Here's what the chronicles don't emphasize enough. Roman warfare depended on line integrity. Their strength came from units supporting one another, overlapping shields, controlled movement. When the line was intact, it was unstoppable. When it stretched, even slightly, it became vulnerable. Khalid understood this better than anyone on the field. He watched Roman officers ride back and forth correcting alignment. He saw cavalry drifting outward, seeking clearer ground. He noticed infantry units advancing at slightly different paces as fatigue and terrain interfered with perfection. None of this alarmed the Byzantines, because nothing was wrong, yet. In fact, the numbers still told a comforting story. The Romans had committed nearly their full infantry strength. The Arab army was fully engaged. No reserves had appeared. No counterattack had materialized. No unexpected maneuver threatened their flanks. From a Roman perspective, the enemy was spent. That belief triggered the next step in imperial logic. Commit the wings. The Byzantine cavalry advanced. Cataphracts on armored horses moved forward with deliberate confidence. These were not skirmishers. These were shock units, designed to strike when an enemy was already weakened, to turn pressure into collapse. The moment Roman cavalry entered the fight, many believed the battle was effectively over. But here's the part the Romans never understood. Khalid wanted them to commit everything. The Arab cavalry on the wings engaged, but did not charge decisively. They fought defensively, delaying, refusing to overextend, drawing the Roman horsemen further from the infantry center. To Roman eyes, this looked like weakness. To Khalid, it was geometry. Distance matters in battle. So does isolation. As the cavalry engagements pulled outward, the Roman army's once solid mass began to resemble something more fragile, a long, advancing body with exposed edges and a center increasingly focused on forward momentum. Still, nothing catastrophic happened, which made the Roman commanders even more confident. They ordered the infantry to press harder. This was the moment the Arab center reached its limit. The fighting became brutal. Shield against shield. Blades in close quarters. Men dying within arm's reach. Dust rising thick enough to choke breath. Casualties mounted. To observers, it appeared that Khalid's army was finally breaking under the weight of imperial force. But Khalid did not intervene. He didn't reinforce the center. He didn't counterattack. He didn't signal retreat. He let the pressure build. Because the maneuver he was preparing required one final ingredient: commitment without caution. By early afternoon, the Roman commanders believed they had achieved operational dominance. The Arab center was still intact, but barely. The wings were engaged. There were no visible reserves, no movement behind the lines. Everything Khalid had done reinforced the same conclusion. This was a conventional battle. And conventional battles, Rome knew how to finish. The order went out to push for decision. Roman infantry surged forward with renewed force. Officers shouted encouragement. Standards advanced. The intent was clear: break the Arab line completely, force a rout, then let cavalry pursue and annihilate the fleeing enemy. It had worked dozens of times before. What the Romans didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that the battlefield had changed shape. Behind the low ridges bordering the plain, something was moving. Not rushing, not charging. Waiting. Khalid had hidden a portion of his cavalry out of sight from the beginning. Not as a reserve in the traditional sense, but as a separate force, operating beyond the enemy's perception. They had not engaged. They had not revealed themselves. They had conserved energy while everyone else bled. And now, as the Roman army leaned forward into what it believed was victory, Khalid began calculating time. Not hours, not minutes, heartbeats. The Roman line was now fully committed. Infantry locked forward, cavalry drawn outward, commanders focused on the front. There was no capacity left to respond to something unexpected, which is why the signal Khalid gave was so subtle that most chroniclers barely mention it. No dramatic charge, no trumpet blast, just movement. Arab cavalry began emerging from behind the ridges, quietly at first, forming behind the Roman flanks, not attacking yet, positioning. The Romans still didn't notice. Their attention was consumed by the struggle in front of them. The belief that they were winning was too strong, and belief, when misplaced, becomes a weapon in the enemy's hands. Khalid waited until the Roman center reached maximum extension, until retreat was psychologically impossible, until forward momentum had replaced caution entirely. Only then did he prepare to release the violence he had been withholding all day. Because what was about to happen at Walaja was not a breakthrough. It was an encirclement executed in reverse. The Roman army had marched itself into a shape it could not escape. And in the next moments, Khalid ibn al-Walid would erase an imperial force without ever breaking its center. The moment Khalid ibn al-Walid chose to strike, the Roman army was at its most confident and its most exposed. Their infantry was fully engaged, shields locked, bodies pressed forward in a grinding advance that demanded total attention. Their cavalry had been drawn outward, chasing control of the flanks. Commanders were focused ahead, not behind. This was the precise condition Khalid had engineered since dawn, and now the battlefield changed shape. Without warning, Arab cavalry surged from behind the Roman wings, not in a chaotic rush, but in disciplined, converging motion. Units that had been invisible for hours suddenly appeared where Roman doctrine said enemies could not exist. The Romans didn't realize what was happening at first. A cavalry presence behind the flanks didn't immediately signal disaster. Skirmishers appeared behind armies all the time. Raiders circled. Probes tested defenses. But this was not harassment. This was closure. The Arab cavalry did not charge the Roman center. They did not strike at the shields. They rode hard for the spaces behind the Roman line, cutting supply routes, blocking retreat paths, and isolating units from one another. Then Khalid gave the second signal. The Arab cavalry already engaged on the wings, the same units the Romans believed they were wearing down, suddenly reversed posture. They stopped yielding. They accelerated. What had been a holding action became a hammer. Roman cavalry, already extended and partially fatigued, found themselves under sudden pressure from both sides. The Arab horsemen struck with speed and cohesion, forcing the Romans inward, toward their own infantry. That was when confusion began to ripple through the imperial line. Officers turned to issue new commands. Messengers rode frantically. Units hesitated, unsure whether to continue pressing forward or pivot to face emerging threats. Hesitation in battle is lethal. The Roman center was still advancing, but now it was advancing blind, because behind them the battlefield was closing. This was Khalid's impossible maneuver. Not a frontal breakthrough, not a single decisive charge. A double envelopment executed by cavalry against an army that believed its flanks were secure. The Romans tried to react. Some units attempted to turn their formations to face the threat behind them, but Roman infantry was not built for rapid reversal under pressure. Shields faced forward. Momentum was forward. Turning meant breaking cohesion, and breaking cohesion meant death. As Arab cavalry sealed the rear, panic began at the edges. Not a rout, not yet, but fear. Fear that there was no way out. Roman cavalry attempted to disengage to restore balance, but found themselves trapped between advancing Arab horsemen and their own infantry formations. Horses collided, commands overlapped, discipline fractured. Then Khalid released the final pressure. The Arab infantry, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken, stopped yielding. They surged. For hours they had been absorbing punishment, retreating just enough to keep the Romans advancing. Now they pushed forward with sudden, ferocious intent. The Roman center, already compressed, now faced pressure from three directions: front, flanks, rear. This was not a battle anymore. It was a collapse in slow motion. Units became isolated. Small pockets of Roman soldiers fought desperately, surrounded on all sides. Officers were cut down trying to rally men who could no longer see a path forward. The killing accelerated. Here's the math that makes Walaja horrifying. A Roman soldier needed space to fight effectively. Shield formations required alignment. Cavalry needed room to maneuver. Once compressed, once surrounded, Roman advantages turned into liabilities. Armor slowed escape. Discipline delayed flight. Doctrine demanded cohesion, where survival required chaos. The Arab cavalry exploited this mercilessly. They struck from behind, targeting officers, standard-bearers, anyone who could restore order. Without command structure, Roman resistance fragmented. Some units attempted to break through the Arab infantry to escape. They were cut down. Others tried to flee outward, only to find Arab cavalry waiting. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a ring of slaughter. Dust and blood hung in the air. Screams replaced commands. The Roman army, once an organized instrument of imperial power, had dissolved into isolated clusters of men fighting to delay the inevitable. This is the moment historians struggle to describe. Not because the maneuver was complex, but because it was unthinkable to Roman minds. They had never imagined an enemy would allow itself to be pressed for hours, only to envelop an imperial army using speed, patience, and geometry instead of brute force. Khalid ibn al-Walid did not outfight Rome. He outweighted it. By sunset, resistance collapsed completely. Thousands of Roman soldiers lay dead. Others were captured. Very few escaped. An army that had marched onto the field believing it would erase a rebellion had been erased itself. And the shock did not stop at Walaja. News of the disaster raced through Byzantine territory. Commanders who had once spoken confidently now faced an enemy who had proven capable of annihilating imperial armies in open battle. Doctrine had failed. Assumptions had failed. And the realization spread slowly, painfully, through the empire. This was not a temporary threat. This was a new kind of war. Khalid ibn al-Walid had demonstrated something terrifying, that Rome's greatest strength, its disciplined rigidity, could be turned into a weapon against itself. Walaja was not just a defeat, it was a revelation. And in the final moments of the battle, as the last Roman formations collapsed, the true cost became clear. The empire had lost more than soldiers. It had lost certainty. The battlefield at Walaja fell silent in stages. First, the clash of metal faded. Then the screams thinned. Finally, even the wounded stopped calling out. What remained was not a scene of heroic victory, but of mathematical finality. Bodies lay where formations had once stood, standards trampled into dust, horses wandered without riders. An imperial army, assembled with confidence, resources, and centuries of doctrine, had ceased to function in a single day. This was not how Rome lost wars. Rome lost wars slowly, through exhaustion, through attrition, through years of grinding stalemate. Walaja was something else. It was sudden, it was total, and it could not be explained away as misfortune. The numbers alone were devastating. While estimates vary, Byzantine losses were catastrophic. Thousands killed, thousands more captured. Entire units vanished from the imperial order of battle. Officers who had survived decades of service died in an afternoon, surrounded, unable to maneuver. Khalid's losses were real, but proportionally limited. His army remained intact, mobile, capable of immediate further action. That imbalance terrified Byzantine planners. Because it meant Walaja was not a lucky victory, it was repeatable. News reached imperial headquarters in fragments at first, confused reports, survivors describing enemies appearing behind them, cavalry where none had been seen. Formations collapsing without ever breaking at the front. Some officers refused to believe it. They blamed terrain. They blamed subordinates. They blamed chance. But as additional reports arrived, a pattern emerged. And patterns are what empires fear most. Khalid ibn al-Walid had turned mobility into annihilation. He had proven that an army did not need superior numbers to destroy a superpower's force. It needed patience, timing, and a willingness to fight the battle after the enemy believed it was already winning. Strategically, Walaja shattered Byzantine assumptions in the eastern frontier. Imperial forces could no longer rely on set-piece battles to impose control. They could no longer assume that pressing forward meant progress. Every advance now carried a question that hadn't existed before. What am I not seeing? That uncertainty slowed everything. Commanders hesitated. Movements became cautious. Concentration of forces increased, but that too made them vulnerable. Because Khalid thrived on predictability. Walaja opened the road deeper into Iraq and Syria. It forced the Byzantines to divert resources, reshuffle leadership, and confront an enemy who refused to fight by imperial rules. But the most profound impact was psychological. For generations, Roman soldiers had marched believing their formations were invincible if maintained. That belief had been drilled into them from the first day of training. Walaja broke that belief. Survivors spoke of being surrounded without warning, of fighting in all directions, of commands that no longer made sense because the situation itself defied doctrine. An army that loses faith in its methods is already halfway defeated. Khalid ibn al-Walid understood this. He didn't pursue the enemy recklessly. He didn't overextend. He consolidated. He prepared for the next engagement because Walaja was not the end. It was the proof of concept. In the months that followed, Khalid would repeat variations of the same logic: movement over mass, timing over brute force, psychological pressure over direct confrontation. The empire adjusted, but not fast enough. And this is where the story becomes larger than a single battle. Walaja shows us something uncomfortable about power. Superpowers collapse not when they are weak, but when they are certain. Certainty makes doctrine rigid. Rigidity makes adaptation slow. And slow adaptation in war is fatal. The Byzantine army at Walaja did everything it had been trained to do. It advanced correctly. It applied pressure. It committed reserves at the logical moment. And that is precisely why it died. Khalid ibn al-Walid did not defeat Rome by violating its rules. He defeated Rome by letting it follow them. That is the quiet horror of Walaja. No dramatic last stand. No miraculous reversal at the front. Just an army discovering, too late, that the battlefield extended far beyond where it had been taught to look. And that is why this battle still matters. Because technology changes. Weapons evolve. Armies modernize. But human assumptions endure. Even today, power blinds itself with confidence. Systems optimized for control struggle against opponents willing to wait, adapt, and strike where certainty collapses. Walaja reminds us that dominance is fragile, not because enemies are stronger, but because they are patient. Khalid ibn al-Walid did not just win a battle in 633 AD. He exposed a flaw that exists in every empire that believes victory is inevitable. And history has been repeating that lesson ever since.